Yes. Well, we are here with the cool as ice Rivers on Mars, taking us from Brooklyn to the beyond with their genre and gravity-defying sound. I am your host, Queen God Is, and we are back for another round of the sonically cosmic ride, known as B-Side. Give it up one more time for Rivers on Mars. We are here with Onka Davis on guitar. Welcome. Chris Edelton on drums. Greg Iron Man Tate on a laptop. And Avram Fefra, who's the hunter-gatherer of Rivers on Mars, meaning you hunted for a new way to expand upon improvisation and you gathered the folks together on sax. Give it up one more time for Avram. So I'm going to start with Greg really quickly on this to expand upon this introduction. Greg is an old friend of mine. I've known him since I was a teenager. And so it's kind of cool to be sitting here with you in this way. You have this laptop in front of you. So first of all, for those who don't know Greg Tate, he is known as the godfather of hip-hop journalism, but he's also a writer. And the reason, Avram, I want to start with him because in addition to being a conductor, a musician, composer, and all of these things, you are a wordsmith. I would love for you to reintroduce each of them with one word that is an unexpected word, a non-music related word, to kind of give us an idea of who they are to you.
Oh, okay. Mr. Onka Davis, the Enigma.
Enigma. Okay.
Mr. Chris Edelton. The Dapper.
Dapper. That's a good one. Do yourself. Greg Iron Man Tate, the...
Oh, the Instigator.
Instigator. That's a good word. And last but not least, Avram?
Provocateur.
Provocateur. Good word. So now we transition into Avram. Avram, this is interesting because all of you have come from so many different spaces within the American music scene and beyond. You've played with hundreds of people in many different bands, and this comes out of the most recent band for you was the Big Picture Holiday Big Band, and you were looking in the way that most jazz musicians or people who identify with some element of jazz want to expand and kind of stretch the craft and see what else there is to discover. And so in 2016, the idea for Rivers on Mars came about. Tell me about that moment where the idea popped into your head and who, of all the musicians you've played with, like how these gentlemen came to mind.
Well, I mean, I had a long trajectory of, one of the things that I love in the jazz world is how you'll get together and improvise and play jazz-related music, and you'll kind of connect on a certain level on the music that you're working on at the time, and it's often original music or other people's what was original music, but since there's so much improvisation, you always bring your own thing to it. And what I've always found interesting is how you might meet in a certain place, but how you got there or the roots that feed that are very different amongst different jazz musicians. Some people have much more of a rock and roll past, some people have more of a funk past, some people have more of a classical training past, all that kind of stuff. Myself, I grew up with a lot of, I had a bridge to jazz, I would say, through CTI recordings, things like that, Earth, Wind & Fire, Ohio Players, a lot of funk. For some reason I was attracted to that, I don't even know why. But that's what got me into the music. I wasn't so much of a rock and roll person. later on, after traversing through all sorts of worlds of a variety of music over the years, I had been working with this gentleman conductor back here, instigator, as you say, or as he said. I wasn't sure who was going to get that one. But in any case, he's conducted me for quite a while under the auspices of the Burnt Sugar family, one of my favorite communities in the world. And there was a moment we were doing a collaboration with the dance companies, Stephanie Bland dancers, up at the Alvin Ailey Dance Center in Midtown. We were doing a showcase. And we were warming up, and Chris was sitting in his drums, and it was sunset, and there was glass all around the room. Beautiful view. Greg started doing some stuff on his laptop that he's not, at that point, hadn't been doing that frequently. And I had my bass clarinet in my hands, and we were getting ready to do this improvisation. And at that moment, I was playing, and Greg threw down some very interesting soundscape stuff, and then Chris kind of naturally, as any musician would do as he was warming up, started kind of playing along with what was going on. And myself, I was kind of looking at the city and feeling like we were the perfect soundtrack.
Okay.
And, you know, and I was just like, wow, the city's blessing us, we're blessing the city, it's this beautiful thing. And literally that night, I went to Greg and said, listen, we got to do like an abstract dance band. And I'm not sure what it's going to be called, I'm not sure what who's going to be in it or what's going to happen, but I kind of immediately thought of Greg, Chris, and I, because we had played so much together. Right. And then as I tried a combination of musicians over several months. Okay. And to be honest, what's funny is I'm a little bit of a control freak. You know, artists tend to fall on these two sides of the world, you know, kind of people who can sleep on couches and people who can't, you know. And that's a good way to put it. You know, and so I'm on that side of it. And but strangely, as an artist, I also have this great internal desire to mess with myself and provoke myself. Speaking of provocateur, I don't only provoke others, I do it to myself. Okay. And so
well, we want to hold that thought there, getting to you as the provocateur, because I think there's a lot there. There's a lot to talk about here. We want to get a lot of the music in just so that the audience can contextualize it. The first song that we heard was called Geechee Pimp Strollin'. I kind of have a feeling Greg instigated that title. Let's go into the next song, which is called Lest the Devil. And then let's get more into these names and titles. Give it up one more time for Rivers on Mars. East Side, but we're going a lot of places with Rivers on Mars. We are here with the enigma, the dapper one, the provocateur, and the instigator who takes an idea, blows it out of proportion, and creates a musical melee of sorts. Greg, you're sitting over there in front of a laptop, and I know you, I think I met you first as a journalist. So I'm kind of convinced that you're sitting over there writing articles, pretending that you're like making music. There's an interesting balance between being a culture critic and music critic, and then also a music maker. And I'm going to come back later and talk about that balance. But first, I want to talk about the language. There's a lot of conversation happening in jazz, period. I feel like jazz is a conversation in which nobody is listening, but everything is listening. Go ahead and wrap your mind around that. And some people can really hear what is being said. There seems to be, and I feel like I won't be incorrect in saying some of these song titles, and maybe even the name of the band itself is coming from being instigated by you. Let's talk about, let's talk about where these titles, these word plays are coming from. Let's talk about Rivers on Mars, which is the name of the group. And then let's talk about the Geechee Pimp Strolling, and then finally the album, which you just released last week, called Deja Voodoo.
Yeah. That last piece was called Lest the Devil Do. A lot of times when I'm just messing around in my little garage band, which is where I make all these beats. Okay. You know, Apple program comes with everybody's MacBook or what have you. Yeah, about 10 years ago, I was in Paris actually with a good friend of ours, a poet performer named Mike Ladd. Yeah. And I think like a lot of people, I thought Garage Band was kind of like this toy program that Apple would just install in the thing. But Mike was actually doing a workshop with kids out in the banlieues, you know, out in the projects in Paris. And he was teaching them how to use it. Okay. So I said, wow, that's kind of dope. You can really do a lot of things with this.
So Mike taught you how
Mike
to use this program?
showed me that there was really something there, and then I just became obsessed, and for the next 7, 8 years following, you know. Okay. Yeah, I just
so we have an insider scoop into what you actually doing on that keyboard.
Yeah.
And so then what about the title of the group and then some of the names of these songs? So I know a lot of the ideas are coming from Avram, but then he kind of tosses the ball your way.
The title for the band definitely came from Avram. The title of the album came from just having one of our pun-filled back and forth conversations, and I said, Deja Voodoo relative to compared to who knows what. And he said, oh, that's great. I think that's the title of the album. I said, cool. You know,
which is good, right? Because for a lot of people who don't have a background in listening to jazz music, because I do feel like there is a pulse that not everyone just really has that pulse. Some people, it becomes background sound for them, but some people really get that like stank jazz face swagger nod because they really are hearing everything, and not everybody has that.
Yeah, even if it's complete chaos.
Absolutely. Like, but like I'm watching you get into the groove, like it's as if you're understanding all of these sounds, and I know a lot of people don't. So for those who don't, I'm just curious, are these song titles in the name, even in the name of the band, is it just kind of fun because it's like, oh, that sounds cool, let's slap it onto this because there really is no linear thought happening here? Or do you feel like there is a story happening in what you're listening to that translates into these titles?
Well, can I start with the band title since that was mine? His stuff falls briefly under that umbrella. Yeah, so so first of all, Rivers on Mars was a song title, a band title that I came up with just because the idea of exploring other universes and finding fertile waters and following them wherever they lead.
Absolutely.
And then, you know, a number of the song titles are mine, and then the cooler ones are probably his. I mean, Greg's just a master wordsmith, but, you know, we talk, and then, you know, sometimes I'll grab something that he says and hold on to that, like Deja Voodoo, and that's how the album title came about. So that was kind of,
So Deja Voodoo, again, like we said, is an album that was just released. We're happy to have that here, debuting here for audiences watching and those in the studio. We're going to go into the next song, and speaking of going into the cosmos, we're going to come back and talk about Sun Ra, which I think is an interesting thread in some of this. We're going to go into the next song called Zenobia. There's another big, beautiful name. Give it up one more time for Rivers on Mars. Okay. All right. So we just heard Zenobia from the album Deja Voodoo with Rivers on Mars, and that was rounded out by the Enigma on guitar. And speaking of Enigma, we want to segue into talking about Sun Ra, because I know that Sun Ra is a major influence on your work and in many kind of iterations of your work. Now, I think Sun Ra would cringe if he read the way that people kind of discuss him posthumously, because you might hear the words American jazz musician. I don't think he would use the word American at all, even though he was born in Alabama. I think he would use intergalactic jazz musician, honestly. Sun Ra.
Well, he disavows being born in Alabama, too.
He disavows being born in Alabama. Forgive me for doing that, but I had to kind of contextualize it for the audience who didn't know. And then the list goes on. Sun Ra is a composer, songwriter, hunter-gatherer in many ways, black man of the cosmos, visionary and revisionary. And he created, after a long stint of musical journeying, he created the orchestra, A-R-K-E-S-T-R-A. And that was big for him, and that kind of played out up until he transitioned. And then in 1990, do I have that? 1999, yep. Greg Tate created Burnt Sugar, the orchestra chamber. And in 1990, you started kind of doing a lot of your work, and you ended up creating Big Picture Holiday. Both were big bands, which range from playing with artists from at least little as 10 to 35 musicians on stage at one time. And Sun Ra also, that was something that he did all over the world. You could have easily dozens of people on stage improvising together. What I'm most interested in is I heard in one of the pieces written about Sun Ra is that really the orchestra was a book club in which some of the greatest masterminds would come together and talk about ideas, ideologies, free thought, and then kind of talk about how it not only inspired the music that they wanted to create, but inspired their lives. And what I know about you all is that, honestly, aside from the musician thing, which is great, that you're a bunch of nerds. And I imagine that this really is just a book club with a soundtrack. So of the many kind of threads that we can pull from Sun Ra to kind of get to this point here as he influenced you. So quickly, what are some of the texts, the thoughts, the messages, the written words that are inspiring how you're thinking and what you're creating?
I'll let Greg do that one.
Okay.
I don't read.
You read music though, don't you?
I used to.
Okay, well it's in there.
I mean, there's a poetics to just the titles of albums, the names of many of the great musicians. I think that was one of the first things that intrigued me when I read Amiri Baraka's book, Black Music. I was about 15. And before that, I was a Marvel Comics nerd, geek. Yeah, to the fullest. And then when I read that book, then these guys with these even more exotic names became my new superheroes. Ornette, Pharoah, Coltrane, Wayne, Sun Ra, Cecil Taylor. And when you got into their music, the first thing you had to pay attention to was just the titles of the tunes, you know, because they were clearly trying to give you word, sound, pictures, you know, to accompany these journeys they went on. Because if you're talking about instrumental music, you don't have to call it anything.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean?
It could be track 45 or
exactly.
44.
Yeah, no, totally that. You know what I mean? Or like Anthony Braxton, you could just come up with, you know, calculus formulas, you know, Boolean calculus formulas for the titles, right? But so you realize that these cats were like myth making.
Yeah, they were.
You know, with the titles. You know what I mean? Like Miles has an album called Nefertiti. Cecil Taylor has one called Nefertiti, The Beautiful One is Born.
But Sun Ra would challenge the idea a bit of not just myth making, because myth is associated with an idea of like a grandiose falsehood of some sort in some consciousness, schools of thought, right? So Enigma, if you want to add in on this, but the idea, but Sun Ra was Enigma.
Well, this is the cat in the band who played with Sun Ra.
Oh,
for
amen.
many years, so
okay, cool. Let's segue over here. because there's some idea that Sun Ra was not necessarily just myth making, but he was revising the way that he was perceived and how he perceived himself.
Well, he always said what he was, and he was everything he said he was.
Okay, so so Onka, you're not mic'd, so I'm just gonna like,
okay.
Yeah, we're gonna have to do a tag team.
Yeah.
Maybe it'll help, but we'll tag team this a little bit.
Let's play some music anyway. We got a lot of music to get to.
Yeah, we do have a lot of music, but I'm not done with this yet, so we're
All
gonna
right,
hold on.
go ahead.
Come on.
I want to get this started, and then I want to go into 2 songs back to back.
Okay.
So just tell me an hour.
Clarify that. I mean, I think you're kind of discussing like what would he think and this and that and the other. He already said what he was, and he was everything he said he was. He was a visitant to this planet, and he proved it over and over again, time and time again, in his physical presence and what he did,
Okay.
and his delivery and his message, and in his music. Because his music is like any other force in the universe. As time goes on, it penetrates further, and it accelerates, and it touches more and more persons.
Right.
And in the jazz world, there's no, Miles Davis included, no jazz artist that was without his influence.
Right.
He had the deepest root when he was on the planet of any jazz musician on the planet, going back to Fletcher Henderson. He
Right.
outlived everybody.
Okay, I'm going to have to pause you there. Thank you for, we have a real living archive in the room. For the people at home, we're sorry. You couldn't really hear that probably as well as the people in the studio, but Sun Ra would say, we hope you feel it. Can you dig it? We're going to move into the next 2 songs, but I want to transition with the idea that, you know, music allows us to make and remake and to reintroduce ourselves not only to the world but to ourselves. We want to give a nod to Sun Ra for that. And I know that there's a lot more to say, but we do have a lot more to say in the music, as Avram was telling in the room. In the meantime, Onka, the Enigma, is going to send our message to Sun Ra. Give it up one more time to Rivers on Mars. We're going into the next 2 songs back to back, Sounds Beats and Cassandra.
Ready, band?
A 1.
guys, we are here with gentlemen from many different musical iterations: Burnt Sugar, the Orchestra Chamber, Big Picture Holiday, experimental jazz fusionists who also consider themselves making 25th century dance music, evoking the idea of ancient future, of which many say that Sun Ra was a pioneer of ancient futuristic music. So I went really quickly before I go to the close. Sun Ra says that he felt like the world has let down a lot of good musicians. He also said that he felt like a lot of avant-garde musicians took themselves too seriously. So let's ask a quick, lighthearted question, and I'm going to go to the close. Greg, what was the last hip-hop album you ever bought? And Avram, what was the first jazz album you ever bought?
The last one I bought was some cats called Ashe Murder Boys. That was yesterday.
Shout out to the Ashe Murder Boys, which is an interesting juxtaposition. And what was the first jazz album you ever bought?
First jazz album I ever bought was a Stanley Turrentine album, a CTI album called, I think it was called Mr. T, Don't Mess With Mr. T.
How old were you?
Oh, God, I was probably about 14, 15.
Ooh.
Something
So
like
we
that.
have a lot of years of music since then to uncover a lot of questions. I encourage you to replay this back and listen to the words of the Enigma on Ka. Give it up for Rivers on Mars one more time.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, BRIC, DK, all of that music stuff.
Both nod and homage to everyone from Miles to, of course, Sun Ra. Thank you so much, Rivers on Mars, for serving this high vibe musical deja vu do goodness on yet another magical episode of B-Side. That's right. If you all want more spellbinding episodes, of course, you can get retransfixed on this and past episodes by tuning in at youtube.com/BRIC TV or Peep Our Podcast at soundcloud.com/B-Side Podcast, or just come on by the studio and get your FIXIRL. As we bid you farewell, I am your host, Queen God Is, here to say this: may good music keep us sane, aflame, and all the way humane. We love you, Brooklyn. Till next time. Yeah.
Yeah.